What's up, babies? Let's do this shit. Really? Everything sucks. At least I don't have to read through all that bullshit right now. No one knows for sure. Elevate, Elo, Divrei, Elohim, Chaim. But this is Mazor with the flag by which we live, bitch. Brugada Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kedoshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al seferat ha'omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is $45 days, which is 6 weeks and 3 days of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto Beit Hamikdash speedily in our days. Amen. The fuck is this shit? We gotta do this bullshit, folks. If you're watching this at home and you're like, why is this rabbi cuss? Shut the fuck up. Anyway. Why? Shit sucks. Creation birth of Adam and Eve. Chava. 36:31. Seth, son of Adam, was born. 35:26. 2:35. Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 34:36. 3:25. Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 33:66. 3:95. Mahal, son of Kenan, was born. 33:01. 4 was born. 31:39. 6:22. Hanach, son of your dick. Really? Probably. Really? No, they're probably tight as fuck. Come on, you little bitch. Oh, what the fuck? Are you fucking serious? Stupid fucking thing. Everything's Kabbalah. Psych, I'm making memes. Reddit. Why? I want to, bitch. Dog, calm the fuck down. All right, how many days have you been doing this shit? 141? Duh. Are you done? What the fuck, dude? Come on, you shitbag. What the fuck? Stupid fucking piece of shit. Sucks. Are you done, though? I'd be like, Rabbi, yeah, I got a question. Yeah, Rabbit's in the back. What the fuck is your problem? I'd be like, calm down, woman. This shit sucks. Fuck this shit. Dog, this shit is the worst. The worst. Dog, this fucking piece of shit. Alright. I've been up all fucking night. But yeah. Is this done, though? Oh, shit. 29th of ER, 5786, Saturday, May 16th. Is that the end of your story? Dude, what the fuck is wrong with this thing? Dog. What is this shit? It's the worst. Fucking piece of shit. Come on, you bitch. This shit sucks. Worst streamer. This is the I'm Dr. Justin Schled. How about you shut the fuck up and just go? What the fuck is it? This is the most difficult aspects and starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Oh, what the fuck? Are you fucking serious? This is Are you fucking serious? Are you fucking serious? What is this shit? Hurry the fuck up. This is the worst stream ever. Dog, this shit better work. What the fuck, dog? Oh, are you fucking serious? Fuck that. Fuck that. Fuck that. Fuck that. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience. Are you fucking serious? If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that. Find this series on Kabbalah interesting. I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Right, folks, so let's do some recap and let's get into the Zohar. So, as we talked about last time, Kabbalah. What is this bullshit? The Kabbalah proper begins to exist in southern France and Spain in the early 13th century. Now, it's really important to note that it isn't about a whole cloth, right? That's the whole point of this class, that we've been tracing how Jewish mysticism has developed in the world of Palestine, in the world of Babylonia, in the world of Jewish magic in Egypt. And we've been tracing how that's being slowly moving into the European context. And it's in that situation, beginning in the early 13th century, maybe the late 12th century, that Kabbalah begins to exist. What the fuck was that? And as we talked about last time, some of the driving issues, and I don't want to say the only driving issues, but some of the more important driving issues are, one, a response against the philosophy of Maimonides, right? We like to claim Maimonides, especially as progressive Jews, as sort of a beacon of enlightenment. But Maimonides, as I pointed out last time, was incredibly polarizing. Maimonides was not universally accepted by many Jews. There were many Jews that hated him and literally turned his books over to the Dominicans to have them burned. Of course, that was a pretty bad idea, because when the Dominicans were like, hey, you have these heretical books, we want you to burn them, can we burn some more books? And of course, they ended up famous to write books. In general, don't let anyone burn your books. Hold your close, and don't let them. At any rate, so this idea in Maimonides of sort of rational, hyper understanding of everything from angels to the body of God. And of course, the mystics were very interested in the body of God, the actual body of God that you could measure in the Persian Parasang unit. And they were very interested in the idea that you could travel to go into the realm of God and sit on God's throne and maybe even be transformed into an angel. And Maimonides saw that this was just a complete nightmare of idolatry and paganism. And so he really tried to get rid of this. And so in some ways, Kabbalah is a response. I think the second thing that's really driving the rise of Kabbalah is what sometimes I call the gap problem. And this gap problem really comes of Neoplatonic philosophy. What is this bullshit? Now, I know, again, I want to drive this home, but I know that many of us have been raised with the idea that mysticism and philosophy, rationalism and mysticism, logic and not be the same thing. Well,
not give a damn what you think about those things. But the middle age, the matter is, philosophy and mysticism, logic and religion have remained very close fellows. And the fact that we post-enlightenment, post-Haskalah Jew, a hard wedge between them, says more about what we need in our desires, our perversions maybe, than it does about what philosophically is rigorous and what historical people actually did. And so part of what's going to happen is that it's not that the
Dog, what the fuck?
Is that they're going to marshal a different kind of philosophy to solve philosophical problems. Now, their philosophy is going to look a lot different than the way we do philosophy now, but that doesn't mean it's not philosophy. And as I pointed out last time, the big problem they're trying to figure out is how to bridge the gap between the infinite transcendence of God and the immanent reality of God. And what's going to emerge in their solution to this in a big way tonight, beginning in our analysis of the Sacred Zohar, is that they're going to try to have their cake and eat it too, because that's what every philosopher does, right? Read the first line of the Logic of Hegel, right? Nothingness plus being equals becoming. There we go, right? Get your cake and eat it too, right? You get nothing, and you get being, and you get becoming. There we go. And we roll on out with becoming. So, philosophers are always trying to have their cake and eat it too. And so, it's not something for inherent. It's going to be basically three parts. They're going to maintain the transcendence of God with the concept of Ein Sof, the infinite. We'll get to that tonight. They're going to bridge the gap between the infinite distance of God and Ein Sof, our reality with Sephiroth, right? We'll get to them tonight too, right? And then they're going to talk about how God is immanent to our world, right? God is immanent. God is it. I love the line in the Quran, actually, which is not part of, obviously, a Jewish system, but I think it's the most beautiful line of the Quran, is that Allah is closer to you than your jugular vein. Right? I love that image, right? Allah is closer to you than your jugular vein. And this image is deeply true of the Zohar as well, that the immanent world of God, the Shekhinah, the feminine world, is as close to you as your God. Right? Now, again, this is a bunch of dudes writing dude times. Who's really close to their bride, right? The woman they're taking to bed, or sometimes the dude they're also taking to bed, right? You can see there's a lot of homoeroticism that we're going to see also, of course, in the Zohar as well. And so what's going on here, right, is they're trying to explain also the experience of immanence, and that's the Shekhinah, the indwelling of God in God's feminine form. Now, some of the other really driving concerns here are going to be sort of the primordial world prior to the creation of this world, the origin of evil. The Zohar is going to be interested in evil and demons all the time in the Zohar. They're going to be interested in trying to read scripture to kind of birth these ideas that they're mining, right? So what you get is these Kabbalists are coming with these ideas, and so what do? They go to scripture and then mine them out, right? It's not like they go to read scripture and then find this stuff. Now, you talk to a Kabbalist, and they'll tell you that's what they do. I think us other scholars say they come with the ideas and they go to scripture and they mine them out. So we have very innovative, beautiful ideas they're going to develop in this form of Kabbalah, but also a radical interpretation of Jewish law. And this is the idea of Ta'amei HaMitzvot. Both and Ta'amei HaMitzvot is explaining the mitzvot, right? Why do we do the things that we do? Why do we do tefillin? Why do we keep Shabbat? Why do we not eat this? Why do we not do shatnez? Why allow linen and wool to be knitting together? Why do we practical reasons for this, right? Or metaphysical, mystical, occult reasons for this? That's going to be a big part of the Kabbalah as well. Well, folks, we've arrived. We are at the gates of the Sacred Zohar, and I will say that the Sacred Zohar is an incredibly difficult, incredibly intimidating text. I'll speak for myself. It's intimidating to me It is a text that I have a very tortured relationship with, just because it's so difficult to get into. I've never experienced a text that is this intimidating. So as I work through these next couple of lectures, and it will be 2 lectures on the Zohar, it's because no one can do service to the Zohar in 2 lectures, much less an even year or a lifetime of studying the Sefer Zohar. It's that monumental. And I just want to illustrate this with a visual example of why we're going to do at least 2 sections on the Zohar, and why I would love to come back and do an entire class on the Zohar. So to get an idea of this, I'm going to hold up just a copy of this right here, this little sliver of text that you see here. This is the longest Kabbalistic text prior to the composition of the Zohar. This is a Sefer Bahir, right? So this is a Sefer Bahir in Hebrew, right? So this is a Sefer Bahir in Hebrew. And what you're seeing here, right, is this is the longest Kabbalistic text prior to the Zohar, right? Now, let's zoom out a little bit. Move my mic. This is the Zohar. Right? This is the volumes of the Zohar. The standard Zohar, just the standard Zohar with no additions whatsoever, right, which is still not considered the entire Zohar, is still all of this. So this is a standard academic Zohar with no commentary. No commentary. That's 3 substantial volumes in the standard edition of the Zohar. So I just want you to understand at some level what we're dealing with. We're dealing with several orders of magnitude for the math folks out there of growth in Jewish mysticism. When I say several orders of magnitude, I'm talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words. So when I say that the Zohar is it's like a giant jump in terms of production. And so what I want to make very clear is, if we were to add up every single text we've talked about so far in this class, right, with the exception of the Babylonian Talmud, you could add everything up, multiply it by 10, and we would still not have the content. It's that substantial. So what I want to drive home tonight is that if the case I'm doing 2 lectures on the Zohar, which I'm extending the class basically now, the reason I'm doing it is because I can't possibly do justice to the text in 2 lectures, and if I tried to shove everything into one, it would be Chilul Hashem. It'd be a violation of God's dignity to do that. So we're going to spread out over the course of 2 lectures now, and we'll start with this text. So what is it? The first thing I want to do is do a little groundbreaking. Where are we? When does this text appear? And the answer is it appears somewhere in Castile in Spain around 1270 of the Common Era. And to give you some idea about when we are, right? Some cultural landmarks that you probably know. We're in the time period of the groundbreaking of the Notre Dame Cathedral. The Notre Dame Cathedral, the groundbreaking was 1163 and was completed just a little bit later in 1345. So we're right in the middle. So if you were to be reading the first sections of the Zohar, you would still see the Notre Dame Cathedral going up. Baghdad, the most magnificent city of the world in many ways at the time, fell to the Mongols in 1258. The Bayit al-Hikmah was burned, the most important library in the world, right? People forget this. The most important library in the world, and they don't forget this. Islamophobia has denied the right of Muslims to claim the most important library in the world, being at the Bayit al-Hikmah in Baghdad, but it falls in 1258. The Bayit al-Hikmah is burned. I would say it's actually a greater tragedy than the burning of the Library of Alexandria in many ways. Also, if you want to think about it more specifically, the Sefer Zohar is composed almost at the same time that Thomas Aquinas is composing his Summa Theologica. Right? So Thomas was composing his Summa Theologica, which is almost the same size in many ways as the Sefer Zohar. He's composing that from about 1262 to 1263. The Zohar is actually being composed about a decade later. But it boggles my mind to think that the people, or the person and people that compose the Zohar could have literally walked to one another and chatted over a beer. Right? They could have had wine together. Right? That boggles my mind. Thomas Aquinas composing this Summa Theologica, and the writers of the writer and the writers of the Sefer Zohar could have made a little bit of a journey, and they could have sat down and talked about theology over a couple of glasses of wine. And my God, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall of that conversation. So just to give you a comment, again, I think it's sometimes important to get a sense of when we are, right? When we are, and what's being produced at that time. Of course, the Summa Theologica is probably one of the touchstones in Western civilization, philosophically and theologically. So the Sefer Zohar appears. What is this book, right? What is this book? Well, it's largely a travelogue, right? That's what's weird about it. It's a travelogue. It's mostly the travels of a 2nd century sage named Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Eliezer and their companions. And what do? They travel around 2nd century Palestine and they talk. That's what the Sefer Zohar is. It's just a bunch of guys traveling around, chatting about stuff. Now, what do they talk about? We'll get to that. Why Shimon Bar Yochai? Well, already in the rabbinical period, Shimon Bar Yochai is already associated with a couple of extreme things. He's associated with miracles. He's associated with extreme piety. In fact, he was so pious that he allegedly emerged from a cave and killed a bunch of people with judgy laser eyes. He hated the Romans. He was a sort of bulwark against the Roman assimilation. And in many ways, some of the documents around Shimon Bar Yochai had already been composed to make him sort of an apocalyptic figure. So in many ways, he's a perfect person to be this progenitor of a radical new kind of mysticism. Because he's already sort of radically mystical and sort of distant from the world, and he doesn't like the Gentiles, which the Zohar is very anti-Gentile, infamously anti-Gentile. So, in many ways, he's a perfect fit for the Zohar. The text itself is placed into the 2nd century of Galilee, and of course that time is a time of very intense Jewish-Roman strife. The text here is also representing a very difficult relationship between Jews and non-Jews, and that situation is going to prove important in just a minute. What do we know about the writer of this? We'll talk more about the author in just a minute. We know that they know rabbinical literature incredibly well, but not only that, they are incredibly conversant in philosophy. One of the things that's really important to know about the Sefer Zohar is the person who writes this really knows philosophy, and they really know Jewish traditional literature. This text is only possible if you know both. And so one of the things we know about that is they really know both. Secondly, the text itself is composed in a strange dialect of Aramaic. It's not Aramaic, it's not Babylonian Aramaic, it's Zohar Aramaic. When I say that, it actually contains all kinds of strange, almost thick examples of its own sort of private language, to misquote Wittgenstein. And the obscure, weird dialect of the Aramaic, which composes the Zohar, is going to be something we'll talk about in actually not one text. It's not like you can read the Zohar again. Some big, some small, some only 7 pages, some 150 pages. It's a text composed of texts. And what I want to do now is go through some of the texts that compose the Zohar. Because you shouldn't think of the text. You think of it as sort of a stitching together of the Zohar. This is a running midrash, right? From midrash is a kind of creative commentary. Folks who've studied some midrashim. It's a common running commentary on the Torah, with almost all the weight being thrown at Genesis and Exodus. And then after Genesis and Exodus, almost the weight of the commentary drops off, and some parts of the Torah are very thinly covered. So it's not like it's a systematic commentary of the whole Torah. Some parts get a lot of cover, some parts get very little at all. Another part of the text are these groups called the Idrot. Right? The Idrot are the two assemblies of the Zohar get together and have conversations. One of these two assemblies, the smaller assembly, the Idrot Zuta, is a very small gathering of people around the death of Shimon Bar Yochai. So it's in some sense the smaller of the two, but the more important one. And the Idrot Rabbah, which is weirdly enough a discussion of all kinds of things, including the commentaries on God's beard. There's a long section about God's beard, and another section called the Sefer Yehuda. And this very tiny part has to do with divine anatomy, and many people think this is a very old stratum of the Sefer Zohar. It's a very weird part of the Zohar. So we have these Idrot, which are these assemblies of the sages, and we have this other section called the Sefer Yehuda, which is, and you can see these words are largely in Arabic, reflecting the names of the sections. And so these sections are very, very unusual and very difficult to understand. I still don't know what they're talking about in half this stuff. It is very, very weird. But on the surface, it's just a bunch of guys getting together to talk about stuff, right? There's also an early section of the Sefer Zohar called the Midrash HaNa'ilam, the hidden Midrash. The hidden Midrash is probably the oldest section of the Sefer Zohar. This section deals with a large degree of things like the nature of the soul, the afterlife, the Messiah. It's sort of like the Zohar learning to be the Zohar. And I often tell people, if you want to study the Zohar for a beginner, if you want some training wheels to study the Zohar, study the Midrash HaNa'ilam, and then move on to other sections, because it's much more familiar to you if you study some Midrash. It's still a very strange section, indeed. Other sections of the Zohar that are very important, make sure I'm not doing this on the slide. Yeah, I'm not. Another section of the Zohar that's very important are the literary subsections, right? So there are a couple of important literary subsections that are very important. And these literary subsections actually include what is called the Saba, the old man, and the Nuka, the young child. It turns out the young child and the old man are in fact related to son and child. These sections are where a young child, a wunderkind, and a old man who's just a donkey driver actually schools the companions. The men associated in the Zohar are called the companions, and these companions are going along the road, and the donkey driver actually shows them that the donkey driver knows more about the hidden world of God than they do. And the Yanuka, though, this wunderkind, also shows that he knows far more about the nature of Torah and the hidden reality of God than they do. And so they sit at the feet of this donkey driver and this child, and they learn all this stuff about the nature of God and the hidden world of the Sof and the Sefer and things like this. So what's important to know about these sections is that the Zohar is not one contiguous book. It's several structural literary texts or fragments into one narrative. The edits are not clear, the edits are not perfect. They are being edited together into one volume. What's neat is that your study, where one get into the more easy section of the Zohar and then kind of work your Zohar muscles up to get to the really difficult parts. Like which is incredibly obscure, but still very, very challenging. It's a collection of very strange documents. In addition to that, version, which are included in the standard. The Zohar, but in the Orthodox world, they're considered Zohar par excellence. There's no one can deny about them. In those later sections, we do a lot of work of helping to make this is all really complicated. So let me just say it again, just to break it down a little bit clearer. We have is a commentary on the book. That's weird. Then we have a conversation, a little boy and the donkey driver and the secrets of Torah. Now we have a lot of miscellaneous. So the thing I want to talk about the Zohar is that it is not U.S. text. It's a quilt. Right? Ever seen a quilt? Right? Quilts are cool. It sounds like you're looking at one thing. If you zoom out, it looks like chaos. Kind of carefully how the quilter made it, you can see how the quilt is designed. But again, if you mount a quilt, it's just a bunch of crazy things together. If you zoom in too close, it looks like things. Zooming out, you can and I think the best understanding is something like a mystical. Let's talk about between 1280 and 1286, in the 1270s. It seems to emanate largely from the person of Moshe ben Shem Tov of Leon, who lived in Castile. You see his names there on the screen. We say that because everything seems to point back to him. Everybody who quotes it, the world in which it seems to be heading from seems to be him. And we do think that Moshe ben Shem Tov of Leon is probably the author of a big chunk of this text. And we'll talk more about, we can complicate that more in a minute. Now, one thing I'll point out here is that in the early days of the Zohar, most people, many people thought it was a forgery. Right? Many people thought it was a forgery. We'll talk about more in a minute. So it wasn't like the Zohar was immediately recognized by all the Jews. Obviously, scripture, that took some time. Also, one note about it is that distinction forgery and pious forgery. Forgery is when you intentionally engage in fraud for your own personal gain. That's forgery, right? When I from, I don't know, if I were to write a check from Tahiti to myself for $10 million, not the check would pass. If I do that, that's really, I'm forging my name on a check to get a bunch of money. But if I were to write a letter forged in someone else's name who was dead to raise someone, am I really trying to benefit myself? Not really. Benefit someone who's maybe even dead, right? Pious forgery, not forgery in the benefit of yourself, is benefit people in the advancement of wisdom. Doing the forging and pious forgery. Pious forgery would be the benefit of benefiting other people. It's still deception, but it's pious deception. Now, there's lots of examples of this in the past. Zohar is typically taken to be an example of pious forgery, though there's some evidence that also say that Moshe ben Leon, Moshe wasn't able to put him into an altar process, and it may be the case on an ecstatic state. He was composing sections of the Zohar in those ecstatic states. We have some evidence to say that's true too. So again, people are complicated, folks. People are complicated. Did Moshe Leon probably write some of this stuff? Yeah. Does that make it a forgery? No. Because forgery and pious forgery and mystical altered states of consciousness really make this complicated. Now, what I want to point out here is some arguments made by Rothschild. I'm going to go through this. People forget he was a philologist. His training was in philology. He was not a PhD of Jewish mysticism because nothing existed like that at the time. He was a linguist. And so when he went to study the Zohar and trying to figure out who was the Zohar, he approached it from a linguistic angle and a literary angle. And what he found was it wasn't from the 2nd century. It couldn't have been. It couldn't have been. Why? Why do scholars think this now? So, a couple of reasons. I'm really going to go through these. The first is there are grammatical mistakes that no speaker of Aramaic would ever make. They're grammatically weird things. Also, they're grammatically blending of dialects that no person speaking Aramaic would ever make these kind of blendings. It's like you were from Boston and San Francisco at the same time. No one speaks like that, right? And so in the ancient world especially, from the Galilee would incorporate weird Babylonian grammatical and dialectical structures. Secondly, there are all kinds of neologisms in the Sefer Zohar that aren't in the Babylonian Talmud, and they seem to be up. In fact, they're not just made up, but there are very specific sounds that the writer of the Zohar likes, right? The ka, sa, fa, and ta sound. There's something about these sounds that the writer likes. Further, there's evidence of medieval constructions, Old Spanish words, and even philosophical ideas that really emerge only in the Middle Ages, specifically in Arabic philosophy. Now, what's really important about that is Moshe Leon was incredibly well versed in Maimonidean philosophy. So much so that we have a manuscript for the Perplexed that survives with his notes on it in Moscow. It's in one of the libraries in Moscow. So Moshe Leon, the purported major composer of the Zohar, was deeply interested in philosophy, so much so that he had a copy of the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides written out for him, and he wrote commentary on it. He knows the language of philosophy. He's in fact, in many ways, fighting with Maimonides, and very closely in left notes behind, and many of the medieval Aramaic, Arabic, and Hebrew words for many of the philosophical technical terms observed in the Zohar. Secondly, the writer of the Zohar that we have makes a bunch of weird mistakes. And he makes mistakes that no person living in the Galilee would ever make. Right? So there are many cases in the Zohar where they say, I'm going from city A to city B, and I'm going east. Except for you couldn't go east to get there. You had to go north to get there. Right? Or you're going from place A to point B, and you have to go north to get there, and they go west to get there. There's all kinds of geographic confusions in the text that would never occur for someone who actually lived there. It's like saying you're going from Ann Arbor to, I don't know, Traverse City, and you go east to get there. Close is not a thing that anyone do. Secondly, there's all kinds of interesting confusions about relationships. So one of the big things that ends up happening in the Sefer Zohar is that son-in-laws and father-in-laws get switched, right? So that people are married to the wrong people or something. So there are all kinds of familiar relationships that we find in the Talmud that just confused. And no one who knew these people would make that mistake. It's like you would confuse, right? It's not like anyone would confuse my brother-in-law Micah for my dad John. I'm not going to do that. And so no one who knows my family would ever do that. And so only someone who doesn't family would make a mistake like that. Secondly, the text is it's in Aramaic, right? But back to the text of the 2nd century to be written in Aramaic. Academic text written in the 2nd century is actually written in Mishnaic Hebrew, not in Aramaic. So the language of the Zohar is just anachronistic. Now we can expect a 7th century text, a 6th century text to be written in Aramaic, or 5th century text to be written in Palestinian Aramaic, not a 2nd century one. It's just in the wrong language. Next, well, someone from the outer Jewish world read the Sefer Zohar and did the thing you might do. They were an investigative journalist, I guess, and they went to Spain and they were like, we talked to Moshe Leon's wife, who seems to these manuscripts to be coming from, and he wrote it out of his own head. His wife ratted him out. His wife was like, yeah, he rewrote this for money, basically. People were paying him. He wrote this stuff out, and he did this, and he used Shimon Bar Yochai's name to bolster his reputation. So his own wife, after he was dead, said, yeah, there were no ancient manuscripts of this. He basically made this thing up. I think that's one of the more damning pieces of evidence. Further, the linguistic analysis of the Sefer Zohar shows that the only document that resembles the Sefer Zohar are other documents written by Moshe Leon. In fact, the earliest quotations we have of the Sefer Zohar are from books written by Moshe Leon, in which Moshe Leon is trying to make a weird mystical point, and he quotes the Zohar to prove him right. Now, that's the cool kind of plagiarism, where you write a magical book, and then you use your magical book that you wrote to prove your other weird book correct. I gotta get on that train, because that sounds like an amazing thing to be doing. And so we see that happening in some early text by Moshe Leon. There are no manuscripts of the Sefer Zohar ever found prior to the period in which Moshe Leon. Every manuscript we have comes after him. Now, it could be the case that just no one survived from the 2nd century, but now one argument is, right, no one like Moshe Leon or anyone else has ever written something profound as the Zohar. Well, people have. The Prophet Muhammad was illiterate. He was a trader. He was a merchant. And he wrote the Quran, and he was illiterate. Well, Muslims take it to be that the reason why the Quran should be believed is because Muhammad could have never written it, because he was an illiterate caravan driver. So simple people, including people like Yaakov Berma, the famous Theosophist, who was just a cobbler, made shoes, wrote some of the most profound theosophical writings in the history of the world. It doesn't take a super smart person to be a genius. In fact, I would say, in many ways, genius has everything to do with being smart in ways that are completely unconventional from the ways around you. Just because no one around you does what you do doesn't invalidate your genius. It might, in fact, authenticate it. So, the preponderance of evidence, folks, is that Moshe Leon, at some level, is responsible for the lion's share of the text we now refer to as the Zohar. Now, what I want to say here is that we don't believe anymore in the scholarly world is at least the 2nd century text. What we are now dealing with is the larger question of textual analysis is, did Moshe Leon write the entire thing? The growing consensus tends to be no. What we think is now going on in Castile around Moshe Leon is a circle of people. And that circle of people, like the Harlem Renaissance or the symbolist poets or other kinds of people in history, they're composing a text jointly in which they're all contributing in all kinds of elaborate ways, and they're stitching this thing together as they go. And that's very clear, because as we see this revealed in history, it's not revealed as one book, it's revealed as a bunch of various tractates that ultimately get edited together as the Zohar, because they're all unified in terms of theme and philosophical mystical ideas. So we now, scholarship doesn't believe now that Moshe Leon wrote the whole thing. That's what Sholem believed. now scholars who are far more confident than I now believe that what we really have here group authorship project, a group authorship project in which there's lots of people going writing things, and motion seems to be the center of that project. And again, you can think about in the 20th century, some of the greatest works of philosophy in the 20th century have been authored by groups of people or by co-authorship. To the Guattari of Sartre and Beauvoir, who did take group authorship, but I think everything that they ever wrote was already imprinted with each other. De Beauvoir owned the Sartre more than people would like to admit. You can think of other kinds of group authorship as well. I will say though that the orthodox position about this text remains that it was composed in the 2nd century and it was made public beginning of the 13th. That's the orthodox position. The orthodox position is this text is beginning of the 13th century. Modern scholarship, academic scholarship does not accept position. But that is the official orthodox. Messiah, when it was printed out, was the Messiah. Earliest printed edition of the Russian was printed at the behest of Christians, not Jews. So it's interesting, even the publication of this text is very complicated. We'll get to the reception of this. So, how does this text develop? And again, I'm already 46 minutes into this may be our lecture, folks. So the Sefer Zohar is composed of some cool ideas. Let's start with first. The first is Ein Sof. Ein Sof is the modern Hebrew word that means infinite. It literally means without end. And so to understand this, we need to get into philosophy a little bit, but to understand that what's going on philosophically this time is what is generally referred to as negative theology. Negative theology is that you cannot say anything positive about God. God is beyond anything you can say about God. So you can't say that God is wise, because any concept you have is always inadequate compared to God. You can't say that God is loving, because any concept you have of love is only compared to an infinite being. And so the idea is that you can never say anything positive about God. You can only get things about God. You know that God is beyond wisdom. God is beyond love. You can't say that God is wise, say that God is foolish. God is not foolish, and God is on wisdom. And this negative theology allows one to maintain that God is transcendent, but you can still talk about God. Right? By saying that God is beyond wisdom, you can still say that God is wise. God is just beyond wisdom as we understand it. But that's an idea that's being incorporated into the Zohar, coming from people like Maimonides and people like Ibn Gabirol, but really it has its origins in the Platonic philosophy of folks like Plotinus and Pseudo-Dionysius, a Christian philosopher. So what's important to note about this, right, is that the starting point of the Zohar is that God is beyond everything you can understand. God is transcendent, utterly transcendent. And so what do we have, right? We have a God in the Zohar that is utterly transcendent. When I mean transcendent, I mean that God is simply beyond anything you can say. God is about true unless those senses are in the negative. God is beyond being. God is not in this room. God is wise. Wisdom due to God is not all of our wisdom. So this notion of Ein Sof is the positing of a being beyond being. So that's the first thing you should know about the Zohar. For the Zohar, the originary position of God, as much as God has a position, is that God is beyond anything you can articulate, anything you can say, anything you can worship, anything you can obey, anything you can love, anything that you can refer to at all. This being is the luminous darkness, right? And again, notice that beautiful contrast. The most dark that you can imagine. God is beyond all things, absolutely, infinitely dark. And yet God is luminous. God is a being that shines. And so that's the contradiction, right? God is the lamp, the infinite dark lamp that shines. And this contradiction is going to drive the Zohar, because God is both beyond all being and yet all being is reliant. It's a result of, and we have all these beautiful contradictions that we have in the sacred Zohar to capture this contradictory reality regarding him. And that can be predicated of anything, relies on God. In some sense, this is God prior to God. So everything you know about God, everything, the Torah, everything, none of that applies to Ein Sof. Ein Sof is beyond all that. Nothing you know about God applies to Ein Sof. Ein Sof is beyond all things that you can possibly think or predicate or imagine. Now, clearly that didn't happen forever, right? Because we're here, I'm here, you're here, stuff is here, schmutz on my floor that we clean is here, right? So, we don't know. In the infinite abyss of the darkness of God, something stirred, something moved, something agitated. There was an allergy where God sneezed out, or crapped out, or ejaculated out. And I'm not kidding, ejaculated. The Zohar loves the image of God moving with God's self and lighting out of Yesod, God's phallus. There's this idea of our earth, God birthing both of these images, sort of a masturbatory or self-impregnation, and out of that emerges being. Zohar moves rapidly between these images. Now, one of the great mysteries of the Zohar is why? Why did God flow out of God? And the answer seems to some level in Neoplatonic literature. And it seems like in the Neoplatonic literature that the infinite darkness, the infinite removal of the Godhead is somehow positively charged. And that positively charged infinite darkness, for whatever reason, flows out of itself, right? It flows out of itself. And that flowing out of itself is something that it can't help but do, right? Either it needs to be seen, or it's so big that it's nothing. It's like a saucer of milk being put on a pot that boils over. It just has to go somewhere. And something happening is, in this infinite darkness of Ein Sof, something flows out. And this outward flow in the Neoplatonic philosophy, it sort of flows out into one thing, flows out into another, and these discrete things have a relationship to the thing flowed out of, and that flowing out and reaches, and then it flows back like a tide, right? So there's procession in the Neoplatonic worldview, and there's reset into the world of the infinite time. And we see this in scholars like Plotinus, we see it in Rothschild, we see it in Orphic philosophers. But the idea here is there's an infinite negation, and from that negation itself is negated, and the outflow is positive, right? That the negation that gets negated outflows in positivity. So we see that, right, in some things like the early Neoplatonic philosophers, like the Neo-Pythagoreans, right? Where all in the Neo-Pythagorean philosophy, we have primordial, and then there's an interior harmonic that emerges from that. So we can be emerging into difference. We have the one becoming the many. We see this in the Neoplatonic world, and of course here are some of the schemata you can see that are very famous from the world of Proclus, late classical German philosopher, and also here from Orpheus, where you can see from the one right full on this side, there is a flowing out of being. If you've ever seen images of the Sephiroth, this looks really familiar to you, right? And these images come from Greek philosophy, but we're going to see very similar emerge in Jewish philosophy as well. So, now, as we mentioned last time, The earliest mentions of these kinds of things that flow out of God are the Sefirot. And the Sefirot, right, are these earliest emanations of God. Now, when I say emanations of God, what I want you to hear is something like, imagine that out of a being flows one more discrete being, right? So imagine that out of my inner consciousness emerges the conscious self. The consciousness of myself is distinct from myself. And so we talk about my consciousness and the fact that I'm conscious of myself as being two, right? Have you like been right where you're like, my knee is hurting, and yet your awareness of your knee is hurting is a different thing, right? Sometimes we talk about pain and suffering. Pain is the feeling in your knee. Suffering is you reflecting on the fact that your knee hurts. Folks ever had like a meta headache, where like your head's hurting, and you're like, now I'm aware my head is hurting, and I'm thinking about my head hurting, right? Notice how those are distinct things, right? They're just things in your mind, but they're distinct things in the mind. That distinction between the pain and the thinking about the pain, the suffering, that's something like a hypostasis, to use a Greek term. That's an incarnate, where the pain and the thinking about the pain are two distinct things. Well, God kind of works like that in Judaism, where we get all kinds of aspects of God, the Sefirot, and these Sefirot are aspects of God contemplating God's totality interior to that totality. Now that sounds weird, but think about yourself. Think about your mind. Your mind is consciousness, emotions, intellect, right? Judgment. You judge things to be true or false, right? Memory, right? You think about memory. It's experience of the world. Our minds, we also think of our minds as having this. Well, imagine this as something like aspects of God, faculties of God, doing different parts that compose what God is. Just like your memory is different than your logical part, just like your logical part is different than your emotional part, just like your emotional part is different than your judgment part, where you judge things to be true or false. Those are all part of your mind. They're all part of one mind. The Sefirot are in many ways like that. Now, of course, I can remember back from a couple of times ago, these ideas first appear in the Sefer Yetzirah, and in the Sefer Yetzirah divides them into 10 of these. But notice back then, they are not parts of God yet. They're not emanations of God, but they will become emanations of God, remember, in the Sefer Rabbi here. Now, what we get here, right, is that what ends up happening, that these 10 numerical ideas that come from Sefer Yetzirah are going to pass into a new stage, right? So the first stage of the Sephirot are the numerical ideas of the Sephirot, right? In the first stage, the Sephirot are combined with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. God creates the world that way. In the second stage, the Sefer Bahir is going to come with the various aspects of God. They are the parts of God that flow out of the inner recess of Ein Sof, the unknowable part of God, and those 10 Sephirot are going to become the parts of God that we know, right? That we can have some intellectual or mystical communion with. So that's the second part, right? And the Sefirot, you can imagine, the second part is kind of like a bridge. They build a bridge between the infinite transcendence of God to us, right? With every single rung of the ladder, the 10 rungs of the ladder, reaching back up to Ein Sof. So think about the Sephirot as a ladder reaching down from the infinite recesses of Ein Sof, the infinite recesses of the no-thingness of God, to the thingness that we are. Because we have to have a bridge between the finite thingness I am. I'm just a finite thing, just some dude, right? And God is infinite. We have to have something to bridge the gap. What bridges the gap? The Sephirot. The Sephirot are the rungs of the ladder, reaching down metaphysically, ontologically, to us. Now, what ends up happening, right, is that you have to define what those rungs are, right? We get the idea that there's some sense of what they are in the Sefer here, and it's in the Sefer Zohar that they become clearly systematized, and we now know a bit about them. And what the Sefer Zohar argues is that the Sefirot are the primordial body of the universe, for the metaphysical part of the universe, right? So before there is a physical universe, there exists in the metaphysical universe. They are the primeval body of human beings, the primeval body of Adam, the Adam Kadmon, which talk about. They're kind of like the being of they're the being of reality prior to physical reality. Now, where the rung on the ladder idea begins to is that in the Sefer Zohar, the Sefirot are not they're not concrete. You can think about the in many ways the Sefer Zohar is talking about these various parts of God, right? About some of these parts of God next time, right? This is God's judgment, God's mercy, God's intelligence, and God's wisdom, and God's beauty, and God's endurance. We'll talk about some of these starting next time. These Sefirot are aspects of God, but these aspects of God, just like the aspects of your mind, right? The logical part of your mind, the memory part of your mind, the emotional part of your mind, the judgment part of your mind. It's like those parts are always clearly distinguished, right? They interact with each other, rule over emotion, but sometimes emotion rules over logic, and sometimes your logic is very powerful and is able to overcome your temper problem, and sometimes your temper problem is able to overcome your logic. Well, you're made in the image of God. And unsurprisingly, because those things are true of you, they're true of God too. The inner world of the divine, inner world of the Sefirot, these aspects of God, are also in a kind of dynamism. They're always interacting with each other. They're always moving around. And this is the reason why. And I know that you're probably wondering, why don't you have this image of the Sefirot on the screen, right? The classic image where there's one sphere at the top, Keter, and then we have Choka, Bina, right? Why don't you have that? Because I want to disrupt that image of qualities of God, the 10 qualities of God, as locked into those sequences. Because in the Zohar, they're not. The sequence you've seen, right? The sequence of the Tree of Life, we'll talk about that more next time. The Tree of Life sequence you've seen is the perfectly balanced version, which never occurs. The Sefirot in the Zohar are always moving, shaking, dancing, crying, screaming, judging, being beautiful and fabulous, engaging in prophecy, gloating over the coming of the Messiah. None of them are in one place. They're moving and gestating and dancing and being always a relationship that's moving in and out. So the thing I want to notice here about the Sefirot, the 10 Sefirot, the thing I want to drive home tonight is that image that you probably have of the Sefirot. Keter, Chochma, Bina, Malchut. You need to get rid of that image if you want to understand this Sefer Zohar, because that image is like it's like looking at a map, right, and trying to figure out where you want to go. Right? Where you want to go is like this. The Sefirot in the Zohar are not fixed things. Where the divine is always. So attached to all the different Sefirot are an incredibly rich, complicated system of names, of colors, of numbers, of names of gods, of locations, of body parts, of emotions, of partner Sefirot, of various patriarchs and matriarchs found in the Hebrew Bible. And every time you see them, they're changing. right? So when you read the Zohar, you might see that one patriarch is named is not associated with one specific sphera, right? Or a specific region of the body, or a specific color. And what ends up happening is these things are dynamic. There's a dynamism. And so part of how to read the Zohar is how to decode this stuff, which can take a long time. Now, what is the relationship between Ein Sof and the Sefirot? Well, it's complicated, right? You have the resort to metaphors, right? We're dealing in the world of poetry and art. The metaphors are things like light, white light breaking into a spectrum, or one candle lighting another one, right? So the infinite dark candle that you can never see it being transmute into lights like Keter. Keter is a light that burns so bright you can't even see it. So it's a light, but it's a light so bright you can't see it. But it lights another light, close by. And that light is so bright that you can't look at it, but you know it's a light. And that light lights Binah. But again, so bright, right? But you can kind of look through your fingers and see it. So what we have here is, again, a metaphor of lights lighting light. They're fountains, right? So you have the very tip fountain, right at the very top of the fountain that's just a tiny bit of water they see, right? But eventually it fills the first bowl, and the first bowl fills the second, and the second, and the second, and the second, right? And you get all 10. But that first spigot of water, you can't even see it. But eventually it fills the first bowl, right? And so what we have here is the idea of God's divine being spraying out, right? Lactating out, right? Ejaculating out, right? The language is all in the Zohar. We'll talk about gender in the Zohar next time, right? But there's a tiny jet that you can't detect, and yet it fills all of being. So God is always beyond, and yet fills all being. It's a very important point on the Zohar itself. And again, the way they separate relate, you can think of them as flowing from one another, right? You can also think of them as nesting upon each other like Russian dolls. So again, it always depends. The Zohar is always moving around about how it wants to depict itself. And I know that you want me to be showing an image, a visual image of the tree of life on the screen. I'm not going to do it yet. Because part of what I want to do is right, with care, right, flowing down to the mouth, the bottom part of the center, right at the bottom of the center. Because again, no up, no down, no left, no right, no beginning, no end. This is God, right? So I know the image you've seen, right? Image, right? That's the image that most people have seen. Something like this image, right? Keter Chochma Bina, and it flows like this. This is an earlier image, just as representative of the Sephirot as this one. This is a more famous one. I think that one's just as valid, right? With the Keter, right, being here. Keter, right? Malchut is the Malchut's in the middle. Notice how that totally changes how we think about the relationship between these aspects of God. And again, both of these are completely accurate when I think about the structure of the divine and the Sefer. So now, just to begin to wrap up tonight, we're a little over. You can imagine the Zohar is something like a drama, not like a soap opera, actually, right? One Life to Live, or Chat. That's my favorite Zohar. This column is a jam. So you can think about the Zohar as kind of opera. It's still here the dark shadow and the song in my mind. So anyway, you can think of the Zohar as a kind of soap opera of these Sefirot. It's all about how the various aspects of the divine relate to each other, hurt each other, double cross each other, how they move, how they dance, how they love, how they fight, how they interact with a harmony, how they excite each other, how they stimulate each other, how they seduce and betray one another. The Zohar is the drama of the Sefirot. Although the Zohar wants a harmony because that's drama free. But what the Zohar imagines is that at the end, at the end of this process, the Sefirot will be harmonized. They will be harmonized, and I bet you even heard, right? In those days, God's name will be one, right? Yom Hahu, Adonai, right? God's name will be one. God will be one. That's a Kabbalistic idea because it's unified. Now, what's interesting about that is that God is not unified yet. God's name is not unified. And if God get unified, that might give us a clue about why Ein Sof ever erupted from Ein Sof at all. It's because God needs us. That we are part of the divine drama. And what part do we play in the divine drama? We are God's wife. Right? We are the wife of God. Israel is the wife of God. And many parts of the Zohar are about this amalgamation of the male and the female, this trans movement of maleness and femaleness, in which those two things and the androgyne being is God. And how do we do that? Well, the Zohar is very conservative. The answer is you scrupulously follow the Jewish law. Right? Don't expect some hippie stuff here, folks. Don't go on down the road and we're going to smoke reefer and free love and do some drugs and trip out and have fun. No. The Zohar is scrupulous about Jewish law, both spiritually, and you reunify God by following Jewish laws. Irrational, strange laws in the Hebrew Bible are for the Zohar the most important. It's a felony, right? You gotta attach boxes to your arm and your head. Yeah. Why? Doesn't matter. There's no logical reason. And it's precisely because there's no logical reason that the illogic of it actually makes it mystically transcendent. And therefore, tefillin becomes an incredibly important part of mystical Judaism. For folks also doing Shabbat, the observance of Shabbat, also incredibly important. And some guys to light tefillin and give Shabbat candles, well, because they're Kabbalist. Because they think that by putting on those tefillin on you, like getting a woman to light Shabbat candles, all of that, if they do that, you're unifying God, you're bringing the world one step closer to redemption. So don't expect Jewish mysticism to be liberal, hippie. You can do what you want. It's rather conservative. By the way, it should not surprise anyone here who's understood anything about mysticism in the Middle Ages. Every mystic in the Middle Ages is rather Christian, Muslim, Jewish, all conservative. In the Christian world, there were no more enthusiastic people about the Inquisition and the Crusades than Christian mystics. They were all. So this is not surprising if we look at the other mystics in their neighborhood. Now, what I want to pick up with next week is I want to pick up with a very short explanation of the Sefirot, right? Because tonight I just want to break down the idea that there's a configuration that you need to memorize in Keter, and Chochmah, and Bina, and blah, 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 Chesak, Nod, Yesod, Malchut. I want to break that idea up, right? If I don't even should, we'll get to it next week, because I want to tell you, what I want to drive home is in the Zohar, the emanations of God are dynamic. They are a soap opera. And soap operas only work because they're dynamic. Because characters are falling in love, double-crossing, getting angry, getting jealous, getting freaked out, making out with whatever. So think about God as an interior, the God in soap opera and the Jewish law. That's the best way of thinking about it at this point. We'll talk about those distinctions, but imagine God's life as God is a soap opera and you doing Jewish law is harmonizing it. That's the best way to think about the way that Zohar actually frames it. Let's not make the Zohar doesn't, because it does not match a steady structure. I put a cheat sheet up, right? A cheat sheet about the Sephirot. We're going to go through them next time, right? We're going to go through all the Sephirot next time. I'll talk a little bit about each one of them, but again, drive home, and we're going to go through them next time. But at this point, what I really want you to use the metaphor of is this is a soap opera, not a structure. Because if you imagine it as a structure, it's a soap opera. We are not done yet, folks. If you think this is the entire Zohar, you are way off kilter. We still have to deal with Shekhinah, right? That is to say, we have to deal with God's feminine aspect, the feminine reality of God, and the queering of God that goes on in the sacred Zohar. The fact that God is not he or she or even they. God is all of those and beyond those. We have to deal with the question of the mitzvot, which we already touched on a little bit tonight. How does Jewish law relate to the sacred Zohar? Obviously, another thing that's very important in the sacred Zohar is its attention to evil. Evil is very important to the Zohar. And if we imagine that the Sefirot, right, the positive attributions of God, have an inverse version of the Bizarro version, backwards version, inverse version, a negative image called the Sitra Achra, the other side. And that negative image of God is the realm of the demonic. And so we're going to talk about Jewish demonology and the world way in which the negative image of God is that world of the demonic. And of course, we're going to talk about how this text got received. This is one of the strangest texts in all of Jewish history. How did this text get received? And I think more importantly, how did it become canon? Because scripture is, but also how in the progressive world did it cease to be scripture? Why is it that you've never learned Zohar? Why is it that in your camp or in your shul or in your temple you would learn prophets, you would learn Torah, you might learn some Talmud, but you would never learn Zohar? How did it get de-canonized? We always wonder about how texts don't get canonized. The Zohar made it through the ringer. It got canonized. How did this among progressive Jews and we claim it back? So we're going to deal with those issues next time, because I think it's very important about how this text got canonized and then lost it among the progressive Jews, who I think benefit from it the most. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, explore the arcane, philosophy, and religion.
What the You fine, go fuck yourself.